Chapter 16. Miss Brotherton visits the widow Armstrong and lays the foundation of a very lasting friendship. She then calls at Dowling Lodge, but fails of obtaining what she went for. As soon as Miss Brotherton and Miss Tremlett had finished their breakfast on the morning after the interview with Sophie Drake in the drawing-room at Milford Park, they set off together on foot to visit the widow Armstrong in Hoxley Lane. "Nothing can happen to us worse than our adventure in the carriage the day before yesterday," observed the young lady. You will confess, my dear friend, will you not, that Sir Matthew's walking into the carriage was more terrible than anything likely to befall us on the high road without one." "Why, I suppose I must, my dear," answered the old lady, "for to tell the truth, I don't think you could look more put out if a constable were to come up and arrest you." "Decidedly not, Miss Tremlett, and listen to the birds, and sniff the sweet air, and then tell me if we are not wise to walk." The old woman confessed that she really did enjoy it, and on they went with the gardener's boy for a guide, till in less than an hour they found themselves before the door of number 12 in Hoxley Lane. Probably their little pioneer was not one of the widow's visitors, for the pass through the hedge leading to the back kitchen door appeared unknown to him, and in answer to Miss Brotherton's knock for admittance, the principal entrance to number 12 was opened by the ragged mistress of the tenement. "Does the widow Armstrong live here?" inquired Mary. "Yes, ma'am," observed the woman gloomily, continuing as she made way for the ladies to enter. "The widow Armstrong is a lucky woman. She has got but one child left to provide for, and yet the gentlefolks keep coming to help her. But nobody thinks of me and my 10 young ones." The ready hand of Miss Brotherton was immediately in her purse. "That is a large family indeed, my good woman. Are they none of them old enough to help themselves?" "The 7 oldest have all been in the factory from most of the time they could stand, ma'am," said Mrs. Sykes, "and if they hadn't, they must have been dead and buried long ago for want of bread. But though they have worked, poor creatures, early and late, there's no more come of it than that their bones be here instead of in the churchyard." "But with so large a number, all receiving wages," Miss Brotherton said gently, "I should have hoped that you might have found yourself better off than you seem to be." "And that's what we are told, ma'am, from the year's end to year's end, and we must bear it, for there is no help, but 'tis a most bitter as the work that grinds us." Neither the person or manner of Miss Sykes were in any degree prepossessing. She was dirty, and in every way untidy in the extreme. She had on her feet the fragments of a pair of men's shoes, but no stockings, the rest of her clothing being barely sufficient to cover her. Her eye, voice, and complexion furnished strong indications of her being accustomed to take spirits, while her frightfully thin limbs gave her the appearance of being half starved. In short, it was impossible to look at her without feeling that she was a degraded, as well as suffering being. Mary Brotherton did feel this, and her heart sunk within her as she thought of Sophie Drake, of her drunken father, of all Miss Tremlett had told her respecting the vice which the spreading and hideous epidemic seemed to ravage in all directions the miserable neighborhood in which fate had placed her. She shuddered as she contemplated the wretched being that stood before her, and till she had spoke the words given above, a deep feeling of the woman's unworthiness chilled the ready pity of her warm young heart. But both in these words themselves and in the tone of quiet, settled despair in which they were spoken, there was a frightful and mysterious allusion to some species of injustice and cruelty, under which accusation she seemed herself to be included. The distaste and reprobation that were a moment before making hasty inroads upon her benevolence seemed suddenly arrested as she listened, and she was about to repeat again the question she had already so uselessly asked, as to whence this universal severity of judgment against the factory laborers arose, and wherefore, beyond all others, submitted to the sentence which dooms human beings to toil, these people should appear to loathe their employment, and execrate, as it should seem, the very means by which they lived. But ere her lips opened to demand the explanation to which she so eagerly desired to listen, a glance at the hard features of the wretched woman checked her. It cannot be from such as these, she thought, that truth and instruction can be reasonably looked for, and as she silently gave her alms and moved onwards towards the door which had been pointed to as that of the widow Armstrong, something like a systematic project for making herself mistress of the knowledge she wanted, for the first time, suggested itself to her imagination. Mrs. Sykes eyed the silver largesse as it fell into her hand with a glance that seemed to devour it, and the words of thanks she uttered were almost hysterical in their eager vehemence. After delaying a moment for the contemplation of this precious drugs twixt man and man, she opened the door of communication, and Miss Brotherton and her friend passed into the dwelling room of the widow Armstrong. Contrary to custom, her lame boy Edward was sitting on the side of her bed, when Mary entered, he was holding her hand and gazing in her face with an expression of countenance which appeared to both the intruders to be the most piteous they had ever looked upon. The poor child was looking, too, most wretchedly ill, and the first idea which suggested itself was that he felt himself to be dying. Notwithstanding the extreme poverty of the widow Armstrong, there was an air of decency and decorum about her that might in any situation have commanded respect, but when contrasted with the appearance of her neighbour, seemed to indicate a claim to more observance than her visitors were showing by this sudden and uninvited entrance. "I beg your pardon, Miss Armstrong," said Mary gently, "for breaking in upon you so abruptly, and I fear our doing so may have startled your sick child. This little fellow is very ill, I fear." "It is long since he has known health, ma'am," replied the widow, "but it is not that which makes him look so white and trembling now. We have lost what was dearer to both of us than all the world besides, and, though I don't think as one will ever look up again, I can't find a word in my heart to comfort him." "What, then, has happened to you?" said Mary, with much interest. "Nothing to your son Mchl, I hope." "You know Mchl, ma'am?" said the poor woman, anxiously. "I have seen him at Sir Matthew Dowling's," she replied. "I wish you never had, ma'am," rejoined the widow bitterly. "We were only starving before, but now we are worse than that." "Do explain to me what you mean, Miss Armstrong," said Mary. "I ought to do it, ma'am, for you speak kindly, and that's a claim poor folks can seldom withstand. But how can I tell you the matter? What's the matter, ma'am? I know nothing, and that's the reason why poor Edward and I are so miserable." "But that is a bad way to get into, my good Miss Armstrong," said Mary cheerfully. "Don't fret yourself about fancied evils, which perhaps do not exist. Little Edward here should know better than that." The pale, broken-hearted boy looked at her with lackluster eyes, but said nothing. "Are you uneasy because Mchl has not been down to see you lately?" resumed Miss Brotherton. "He never failed to come, ma'am, till he was carried away from us," replied the widow with a sob that seemed a result of strength exhausted and weakness that could struggle no longer. "Carried away from you?" cried Mary, changing color. "What do you mean, Miss Armstrong? Who has carried away Mchl from you?" "Sir Matthew Dowling, ma'am, has had him taken away," and another sob followed the words. "Do not think I torment you thus from idle curiosity," pursued Mary, bending over her, "but I entreat you to explain to me fully what you mean. I am greatly interested for your little boy." "I thank you for it, ma'am," returned the poor mother mournfully, "but I can tell little that you or any grand lady, the friend of Sir Matthew, would think to the purpose. Yet the parting with him without one blessing or one kiss is hard to bear, though we don't justly know that any harm's come to him." "I am no particular friend of Sir Matthew Dowling's," replied Mary, with an accent which perhaps spoke more than her words. "Then I will tell you about Mchl," exclaimed the lame boy, coming round the bed to the place where she was standing, and looking into her face as if he thought he could read all her thoughts there. "You have seen poor Mike when he was living there, ma'am?" "Yes, I have, my dear boy," she replied, gazing with deep feeling at his pale but beautiful countenance. "I have seen him there more than once, Edward, and I am quite sure he was not happy, though he was dressed so fine." "He was more unhappy 10 times over," replied Edward, "than when he was as ragged as me." "Was he treated unkindly?" demanded Mary. "He was beaten, kicked, and spit upon," cried Edward, bursting into tears, "and then he was told to laugh and look merry." "A wretched, wretched sort of cruelty," she replied, "of which I can well believe Sir Matthew's capable. But surely you do not suppose that he has run away from it without telling you or his mother that he has had such an intention?" "If you knew Mike better, ma'am, you wouldn't think he could do such wickedness," said the mother. He has stood beating with strap and stick for years, ma'am, young as he is, and he's never asked to stop from the mill a day, though he has been bruised almost to jelly, and worse than that too, poor lamb, 100-fold with such a heart as his. He has seen his lame brother there, that is always dearer, a great deal to himself. He has seen the cruel stripes fall upon his poor shoulders too. And though he has come home with his little face washed with tears from it, he didn't think of running away. Mary saw that she had given pain, and hastened to atone for it by expressing her sorrow for supposing such a thing possible, and then repeated her question, that she might be told what it was that had happened. The widow then related more succinctly than might have been expected all that had passed between herself, her boy, and Miss Martha Dowling on the morning which followed the theatrical representation at Dowling Lodge. And before she proceeded further, Edward bore testimony to the spirited and courageous willingness with which his brother had adopted the proposed scheme. He had, it seemed, as usual, watched Teddy's return from the factory, told him what Sir Matthew proposed to do for him, and declared that as hard as it would be to part with him and mother, he was ready and willing to start, and was quite determined to be the best boy that ever was prenticed, and to be workman enough to maintain them both as soon as his time was out. Here the widow again resumed her narrative, and related very accurately the scene of the following morning, dwelling much on the young lady's kind manner, and on her own putting it to her whether she advised that the child should go or not. "And Martha Dowling counselled you to let him go?" demanded Miss Brotherton. "Yes, again and again she did," replied the poor mother. "Are you quite sure it was Miss Martha?" "Oh yes, ma'am. My mite took care to make me understand that the day they came together." "Then be quite easy in your mind, Miss Armstrong," said Mary eagerly. "I have no great liking for Sir Matthew Dowling. I do not think well of him, nor have I much to say in favour of any of his family. They seem to me to be cold-hearted, selfish people. But for this one, this Martha that you speak of, I will undertake to answer for it that she has never deceived you, and that if she advised you to let Mchl go, it was because she thought the doing so would be advantageous for him." "Bless you for ever and ever, ma'am," cried Mrs. Armstrong, seizing the hands of Mary and pressing it to her lips. "There is truth, ma'am, in your voice and in your eyes. Do as I do, Edward dear. Look at the kind face of this young lady, and see if you can't find comfort from what she says. I did think myself, ignorant as I am, that the young lady had an honest face. But oh, ma'am, let as it be will, and make the very best of it, 'tis cruel to have our darling taken away in this fashion, without one word of take leave and blessing." "Indeed it is," replied Mary, "and your being ignorant of the place of his destination increases his anxiety. But on this point, at least, I think I shall be able to set your mind at rest. Before this morning tomorrow, I will take care to see some part of the family at the lodge, and shall certainly not scruple to inquire every particular respecting your boy. Keep up your spirits, therefore, both of you, and for the future, let this little fellow here look to me for his wages. I won't have him go to the factory any more. What sum has he been receiving for his work?" Astonishment very literally rendered the widow Armstrong dumb on hearing this most extraordinary proposal. Poor soul, a few short days ago it would have been sufficient to make her forget her weakness and her want, and have her put her in a state of mind that queens might envy, for she would hardly have been able to remember that it was possible to have another wish. But now the first use she made on recovering her speech was to exclaim, "Oh, Mchl, Mchl, why bean't you by to hear this?" "He shall hear it, Miss Armstrong," said Mary, in a voice of such cheerful confidence that the terrors of both mother and son seemed to vanish before it. Miss Tremlett, too, ventured to add an encouraging commentary upon Mary's promised visit of inquiry at the lodge, observing that it was altogether out of probability that they should want to make any mystery as to where the little fellow was gone. Miss Armstrong, as she listened, seemed almost too happy to credit the evidence of her own senses, but in the deep-set, melancholy eye of Edward there was still an expression of suffering and fear that looked as if misery had taken hold upon him that could not be relinquished. "Now I must go," said the young lady, rising, "or I shall hardly have time to keep my promise. But I must settle with you first, my dear boy. What was the amount of your wages by the month?" "6 shillings, ma'am," replied Edward, looking at her as she drew out her purse, with an eye that seemed to doubt what it beheld. 6 shillings! Cried Miss Brotherton, as she put the pitiful wages of a long month's agony into the little trembling hand. And you have lost your health and liberty for this? Tears started to her eyes, as she contemplated the look of wonder and delight expressed by the countenance of the poor widow, yet that was not turned upon her. Stretching out her arm to the boy, she caught him to her bosom, and held him there, much as if she had suddenly beheld him snatched from the fangs of some devouring monster. The face of the child himself she could not see, but his whole frame trembled, and they fancied he was shedding tears. God bless you both, she said. Tomorrow you shall see me again. And so saying, she took the arm of her friend, and again passed through the dwelling room of Mrs. Sykes. The woman now had 3 dirty creatures round her, to whom she was giving bread. Heaven keep you, ma'am. This is your treat, she said, as Mary and her friend passed through. It is the first time for many a week that I have fed 'em so freely, poor creatures. Miss Brotherton's heart was too full to answer. She nodded her head and passed on. Their homeward walk, up Hoxley Lane, across the London Road, and along a pretty shaded bridle road that led to the gate in her own park paling, was performed almost entirely in silence. There was a state of mind in which ideas come with too much violence and rapidity to be told off in words. When this happens from an excess of happy imaginings, no condition can be more delightful. But when, as in the present case, it arises from the remembrance of painful realities, it is greatly the reverse. The misery round her was no longer a matter of doubtful speculation, but of a most frightful certainty. Neither was it any vice in little Edward Armstrong which drove him to offer up his sickly suffering frame to ceaseless labour at the rate of 3d. for each long painful day. She felt oppressed, overwhelmed, and almost hopeless. Yet at that time Mary Brotherton knew not, guessed not, dreamed not of the 100th part of what unhappy class who had thus roused her human sympathies were daily and hourly suffering around her.